Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 25 for History 101. Now, the last time we met via video lecture, we had reelected Andrew Jackson. In 1832, he used that to destroy the bank. We talked about the pet bank scandal. So we're pretty much done with Andrew Jackson, and we're moving our way towards the election of 1836. But one thing we need to talk about that happened in that second term of Andrew Jackson was a brand new political party came on the scene. The National Republican Party sort of faded off into oblivion after Jackson's two firm victories with the brand new Democrats, and a brand new party emerged to replace them, known as the Whig Party. So let me explain to you how they got their name, what they're all about, and because they're going to be a player in the next few elections here. Excuse me. Now, the Whig Party was created by a very famous congressman from New Hampshire, Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster could not stand Andrew Jackson. He thought he was a tyrant, verging on the level of dictator, and was a big-time critic of his in Congress. Now, to show their displeasure with what Andrew Jackson did to the National Bank, and especially his National Bank veto speech, where he sort of single-handedly tried to declare it unconstitutional like the Supreme Court would, Daniel Webster and some of his fellow congressmen pulled a stunt. They started to show up to work at the Capitol dressed in long black robes with white powdered wigs on. They were stopped by reporters, and they said, "Okay, what's going on here, fellas? What's with the costumes? It's not Halloween." Daniel Webster, in a speech on the steps of the Capitol, basically founded the Whig Party. He said that he thought he must have had a nightmare. He dreamt one night that the United States didn't have a president anymore. They had a king, King Andrew the First. And since we have a king now, it was no nightmare, he claims this is what's happened, then they must be members of Parliament over in England. So they needed to start to dress the part. Members of Parliament show up with long black robes and white powdered wigs on. So this is how he and some of his colleagues dressed to go to Congress, symbolically criticizing King Andrew I. This turned into the Whig Party. So, in the impending election of 1836, in the beginning, Andrew Jackson toyed around with the idea of running for an unprecedented third term. Now, his advisors took him aside and said, "You know, what the critics will immediately say, they'll say that you think you're better and greater than George Washington himself." Andrew Jackson, being quite the egotist, said quite frankly, "I am. So what's the problem here?" Now, what stopped him from running for a third term was his health. Andrew Jackson suffered horribly from a condition known as the gout, which is an extremely painful inflammation of joints, typically in your feet. And back in that day and age, there was absolutely no cure for it. So he'd have his bouts of the gout, as it's known, which was very painful. Excuse me, it must be my allergies, the pollen's all in bloom. Now, also, he was slowly dying of lead poisoning. he had 2 bullets in his body that the surgeons were unable to remove because they couldn't find them without cutting them apart. One from a military war wound, the other a wound from a duel that he participated in. So he was slowly but surely dying of lead poisoning because these bullets were dissolving in his body. So his health stopped him from running for a 3rd term, not George Washington. So he will endorse his vice president from his 2nd term, somebody that he certainly adores compared to John C. Calhoun, who he wanted hanged. And that's Martin Van Buren from the state of New York. So Van Buren will be the Democrat running for the presidency in 1936. And if you look in your book in the back, we've been looking at these election tables because for whatever reason they're not putting election maps in these chapters. You can see at the bottom of page 821 the election of 1836. The Whig Party, which is new, is also very disorganized. They hold their national nominating convention in the tradition of the anti-Masonic Party. Remember, they started that tradition 4 years earlier. Now the Democrats and the Whig Party both hold national nominating conventions, but it's their very first ones. They really don't know what they're doing. The Whigs are so disorganized, they end up nominating 4 candidates, which cuts their own throats. They will nominate a hero in many people's minds from the War of 1812, former General William Henry Harrison. They'll nominate another candidate, Hugh White. Daniel Webster, the founder of the Whig Party, will be a candidate. And also will Willie P. Magnum. So they're going to run 4 people against Martin Van Buren. And if you look at the popular vote total, roughly 25,000 votes separate the 2 candidates, an extremely close election. But it's divided up. And those 4 candidates divide up the Electoral College votes. So because of that, Martin Van Buren prevails and wins this election. Now, almost immediately upon his election, a panic will hit the country. Now, remember, a panic is either a recession or a depression in the 19th century. We don't use the terms recession and depression back then. We talked about the Panic of 1819 that was still, in Jackson's mind. The Panic of 1837 hits the country, and it's an outright depression. And what's going to magnify it even further is the only real tool that a president would have at his disposal to do anything about an economic downturn back in those days was the national bank. Well, remember, it doesn't exist. Andrew Jackson dismantled it, withdrew all the money, and it had closed shop in 1836. So the only tool that Martin Van Buren would have had at his disposal to do something about this didn't exist anymore. But he couldn't say, hey, I wish I had the bank, because he was part of the Jackson administration that got rid of it, whether he agreed with it or not. So this is going to be a pretty horrible time for America for the next 4 years. We're going to be mired in this depression. But what we want to shift to next, as your book does in chapter 12 in the 270s in page range, is we want to talk about what happens in Texas. Now, the history of Texas, or as the Mexicans called it, Tejas, is quite interesting. in the mid 1820s, Mexico, which was a brand new country, saw a problem that existed. Their country was huge. You know, if you look at the maps that we've looked at back then, Mexico was not only Mexico of today, but it was the entire southwestern United States and the western half of, or the whole state of Texas. And the United States didn't control that territory. It was all part of what had been Spanish territory, and Mexico wins their independence in 1821. So by the mid to late 1820s, Mexico was very afraid that if settlement didn't happen in this northern province that they called Tejas, that the United States would think they didn't care about it, didn't want it, and would start moving in and just take it over. Because, of course, we had the power to do so if we wanted to. So what they're going to do is come up with a program to encourage settlers in Tejas, as they call it. Now, they tried to get Mexican citizens to move there, and they weren't really interested. There were much more desirable places to live in this huge area of Mexico, like in central Mexico or along the Pacific coast, up into California, which was part of Mexico at the time. And Texas, to most Mexicans, looked like a big, giant wasteland filled with tumbleweeds. So they really weren't interested in moving there. So what Mexico will do is they'll hire an American newspaper man by the name of Stephen Austin. They'll give him a gigantic land grant in Tejas and tell him he can hand out parcels of land to Americans who want to move there, but they have to agree to do two things. First of all, if an American accepts one of these free land grants in Tejas, they're going to have to renunciate their American citizenship and instantaneously become Mexican citizens. Now, that is something that is, pretty dramatic. Nations like the United States do not look kindly at one of their citizens renunciating their citizenship. It's like, go right ahead, but you'll never be an American again. Also, part of what you had to do to qualify for this free land grant, remember, Spain was a Catholic country. Mexico is a Catholic country. So if you weren't a Catholic, you had to agree to convert to the Catholic Church. So if you agreed to renunciate your citizenship and become a Catholic, if you weren't one already, you could get a free land grant in Tejas, or Texas, as we call it. Stephen Austin was very successful with this program. And in fact, by the mid-1830s, he was too successful. He had recruited over 30,000 Americans to come to Tejas and set up farms. Now it's a case, before they had nobody living there, now they might have too many, especially given the fact that they were all former Americans. Now, these people that end up settling in Texas are sort of characters on their own. They really don't consider themselves Mexicans, even though they had to renunciate their U.S. citizenship and become one on paper. They consider themselves Texans. So, what's going to happen in the mid-1830s also is there's a revolution in Mexico. And in this revolution, there's going to be a change in leadership, and the general who leads this revolution, General Santa Anna, will take over as the leader of Mexico. Now, once he takes over, he's looking at the government books of the Mexican government, trying to figure out where money's spent and where revenue comes from and so forth, because he had just been a general, took over. And he sees all this documentation on Tejas and what was going on up there. It was kind of forgotten about by many Mexicans. And he noticed one glaring thing is that somehow the settlers in Tejas or Texas were not paying any taxes whatsoever to the Mexican government. Somehow they were tax-free. So he sends some officials up there to investigate what's really going on in this northern province of Tejas. And when these investigators come back and report to General Santa Anna, he's not happy. They report, there's 30,000 of them scattered all over the place, all with some pretty prosperous farms. They really should be paying taxes. But then what he tells them is even more alarming. He's told that these people really don't consider themselves Mexicans. They'd taken on their own identity of Texans. And also, they saw numerous Protestant churches. There aren't supposed to be any. They were all supposed to convert to the Catholic religion. Well, obviously, many of them didn't. Then the other disturbing fact was there were African slaves there. There weren't supposed to be. Slavery was illegal in Mexico. It was from the day they were created in 1821. So Santa Anna is pretty angry. So he sends a new group up to Tejas, a group of tax collectors. And they're to notify these Texans, your tax-free days are over. You're going to start paying taxes to the government of Mexico. Well, these Texans have a different idea. They're going to send these tax collectors back to Mexico City, many of them tarred and feathered, and tell them, you know what you can do with your taxes. So Santa Anna now has no choice but to take a military contingency north to Tejas to establish order and force these Texans to pay taxes. This ends up turning into the Texan Revolution in 1836. Now, if you open your book to page 275, we've got a map of this revolution that takes place. Now, the one battle in this revolution that you're no doubt all familiar with, that you can see here, is the little red bomb going off near the city of San Antonio. That's the Alamo that happens on March 6th, 1836. And you have that famous painting of the Battle of the Alamo there, and there's old Davy Crockett in the center of the picture. The Alamo is a pretty interesting story. Now, the Texas revolutionaries were all under the command of one of Stephen Austin's best pals that he had convinced to come down and live in Tejas. That's Sam Houston. Sam Houston will become the commander of the revolutionaries because he has military experience. He was an officer during the War of 1812. And he had moved to Texas to kind of be Stephen Austin's right-hand man and had given up a career in politics in the state of Tennessee. So Sam Houston had given orders to the contingency of troops at the Alamo, including Davy Crockett and Sam Bowie and other famous people who had come down from the United States to assist the revolutionaries. He'd told them it's time to withdraw from the Alamo. It's not the place to fight, and Santa Anna and his army of thousands of troops is headed right in your direction. So I want you to fall back and join me. Now, the Alamo was an old Spanish mission. Remember those church forts we talked about? And the Alamo today has been preserved, but unfortunately it's right in the center of downtown San Antonio, so it's hard to imagine battlefields when you look out the windows of the Alamo and see skyscrapers. Now, Sam Houston is waiting for these troops to withdraw from the Alamo and join him. Instead, a messenger arrives. And the messenger says, "Send reinforcements. We've decided to stay and fight here at the Alamo." Now, this was a huge mistake, and Sam Houston basically is saying, what are they doing? They're completely disobeying orders from a commanding officer. Now remember, he's militarily trained. He sends a messenger back. No reinforcements are coming. You retreat now. It was too late. Santa Anna and his 2,000 to 3,000 men, we're not sure on the total number, attacked the Alamo, which is being defended by 200 guys. Now, granted, they had Davy Crockett and Sam Bowie and his big knife and other brave men there. I don't care who you have there. George Washington could have risen from the grave, and the outcome would have been the same. When you're outnumbered at least 10 to 1, you lose. Everyone at the Alamo on the Texan side died in that foolish battle because they disobeyed orders from Sam Houston. Now, this is a big blow to the revolutionaries in Sam Houston, but Sam Houston's a very brilliant man. He uses it to inspire his troops. And every time they enter into battle, the cry on the battlefield from his troops is, "Remember the Alamo." So, Sam Houston is a great strategist also. And he will use his strategy to lure the Santa Anna and the troops into a trap at the famous battle of San Jacinto, which you can find on the map. It's north of Galveston, near the Houston area, which will be the decisive victory. And in fact, it's the only blue bomb, one of the few blue bombs you see going off on the map, which denotes a Texan victory. What will happen here is Sam Houston will use a brilliant piece of strategy, and he'll lure them into a trap. Bear with me for a second. I got to find one of my notes in particular here. There it is. Now, here's the background information on San Jacinto. Many of you have probably heard of the Yellow Rose of Texas. It's a famous song Texans love to speak. But the Yellow Rose of Texas is an actual person. Her name is Emily West Morgan, and she's going to be an integral part of the Texas Revolutionaries' victory and why she's the subject of that famous Texan song. Now, here's what happens. She was a slave of one of Sam Houston's top officers. She wasn't your typical slave. She was highly educated and highly trusted by Sam Houston's officer and Sam Houston. And she was put in charge of procuring the supplies that were arriving at the port of Galveston, coming from U.S. interests to supply the revolutionaries, just like Davy Crockett and Sam Bowie were down there fighting. She ends up being captured by Santa Anna. Now, Emily West Morgan was also a very attractive woman, and Santa Anna took a liking to her and made her his personal servant. So she's with Santa Anna all the time, tending to his every need. And little did Santa Anna know, not only did Emily West Morgan speak English, she was very fluent in Spanish, but she didn't let on. So she's witness to all the top meetings of Santa Anna and his top generals. She is taking notes mentally on everything Santa Anna is planning, and then she's slipping notes to civilians as they march through the Texas countryside to be taken to Sam Houston. So Sam Houston is always a step ahead of Santa Anna, thanks to Emily West Morgan, the Yellow Rose. So this allows him to lure Santa Anna into a trap at San Jacinto. And they pull off a perfect sneak attack on them and completely defeat Santa Anna and his forces. Santa Anna is wounded in the battle, and he's forced at gunpoint by Sam Houston to sign a declaration granting the Texans their independence. Now, then also, Santa Anna and his men retreat back to Mexico City, and now Texas is its own country. It's been granted its independence by Santa Anna and the Mexicans. And for the next almost 10 years, from 1836 to 1846, Texas will operate as a totally independent nation known as the Lone Star Republic. And its very first president will be the hero of the war, Sam Houston. So that's where I'm going to end this lecture. I need to take a break, get a drink of water, get my voice back, and I'll pick up where I left off with the Lone Star Republic. So I'll see you shortly.